Welcome to Hidden Chapters. Not every story needs action. Some only need someone paying attention. Let's begin. I recognized the street. I didn't recognize my own house. I recognized the street immediately. Same narrow lanes. Same faded paint on the buildings. Even the light fell the same way it always had in the late afternoon, cutting long shadows across the pavement. For a moment, I felt that familiar relief, the kind you get when you finally step out of someone else's world and back into your own. Then my key didn't work. I tried it again, slower this time. Same result. Solid resistance. No give at all. I stepped back and checked the number on the door, even though I already knew it was right. It was my building. My apartment. My door. I knocked once, light. Then again, harder. My wife answered, surprised to see me standing there like a stranger. Not relieved. Not alarmed. Just, confused. Like she'd forgotten something important and only realized it too late. The lock was changed, she said before I could ask. She said it casually. Too casually. Inside, everything looked familiar at first glance. Furniture in the same places. Photos still on the walls. But the feeling was wrong. The air felt organized, controlled, like a space that had been adjusted to accommodate something unspoken. I asked why the lock had been replaced. She said the police suggested it. That stopped me. Suggested isn't the word people use when nothing's wrong. My son was in his room. Older than when I'd left. Quieter. He looked at me like he wasn't sure whether to relax yet. We exchanged the kind of half-hug that happens when people don't know how much distance is allowed anymore. I asked him how school was. Fine, he said. I asked him what happened while I was gone. Nothing, he said, too quickly. That night, I walked through the building alone. Not officially. Not dramatically. Just listening. Watching. The way you do when you're somewhere unfamiliar and don't trust what you're being told. There were lights on in the lower stairwell that shouldn't have been. Doors unlocked that used to stay sealed. Footsteps where no one lived. This wasn't random. It was managed. Standing there, in my own building, I felt something I hadn't felt overseas. Displacement. Not because danger had followed me home. But because while I was gone, my home had learned how to live with danger without me. And whatever had happened here. It hadn't ended. I didn't sleep that first night. Not because I was tired or restless, but because the apartment sounded wrong. Every building has a rhythm you learn without realizing it, pipes expanding, doors closing, the way footsteps echo depending on the hour. This place had a new pattern, and I didn't recognize it yet. At 2:17, someone moved through the stairwell. Not loudly. Not in a hurry. Just enough sound to confirm intent. I waited, counting breaths, listening for anything that didn't belong. When nothing followed, the silence felt practiced, not accidental. In the morning, I asked my wife about it. She hesitated. That was answer enough. She told me it started months earlier. A disturbance on one of the upper floors. Shouting. Something breaking. Someone taken away in a way that didn't involve an ambulance. The police arrived quickly. Left even faster. No report. No follow-up. Just advice. Change the locks. Don't ask questions. It's being handled. People trust advice when it comes from authority. Especially when they're scared and alone. The building adjusted quietly. Maintenance schedules changed. Access points were modified. Some doors were left unlocked for emergency use. Emergency for who, no one said. My son avoided eye contact while we talked. When I asked him directly what he'd seen, his shoulders tightened. He said he'd been in the hallway when it happened. Close enough to hear names being used. Close enough to know it wasn't random. Close enough to be noticed. After that, unfamiliar men began appearing in the building. Not aggressive. Not threatening. Calm. Polite. Always in pairs. They wore nothing official, but they moved like they belonged. They spoke to residents individually. Explained things. Reassured them. And slowly, the building learned new rules. I walked those floors again that afternoon, this time with purpose. I noted blind spots, sight lines, places where sound carried and places where it died completely. Storage rooms that had been repurposed. Doors that had been reinforced from the inside. Someone had done a quiet assessment here. Professionally. That night, I stood in the stairwell where I'd heard the movement before. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust, not neglect, but use. Fresh footprints marked the concrete, wiped halfway clean. This wasn't a temporary situation. It was infrastructure. Back in the apartment, my son finally spoke. They said not to call anyone, he told me. They said it would make things worse. I asked who they were. He shrugged, the way kids do when the truth feels too big to carry. I don't know. They knew our names. That was when I understood something fundamental. Whatever had taken root here hadn't relied on violence to survive. It relied on familiarity. And familiarity is harder to fight than fear. I looked around my own living room, the place I'd spent years imagining while I was gone, and realized I didn't know who else had stood in this space while I wasn't here. The building wasn't compromised. It had been converted. And the people inside it, my family included, had been trained to accept that conversion without resistance. Standing there, I made a decision I hadn't planned to make. If no one was willing to acknowledge what this place had become, then I would. But not as a resident. As an outsider. Because sometimes the only way to see what's wrong with a familiar place is to stop treating it like home. I waited 2 days before I did anything. Not because I needed more information, but because I needed to understand the pattern. Whatever was happening in this building didn't rely on speed. It relied on routine. Interrupting it too early would only teach it to adapt. So I watched. I left the apartment at odd hours and returned without warning. I took the stairs instead of the elevator. I paid attention to which floors were quiet at night and which ones weren't. By the third evening, I could predict movement within a margin of minutes. That's when I knew this wasn't improvisation. It was schedule. The building had a service level that residents didn't use anymore, an old maintenance corridor that connected storage rooms and emergency exits. It had been sealed years ago after a minor fire. Or at least, that's what I remembered. The door was still sealed. From the outside. The next night, I didn't wait for midnight. Patterns become predictable when no one challenges them. I wanted to see how the building reacted when something happened out of sequence. At 21:40, I entered the stairwell from the rear entrance instead of the lobby. The camera there had been replaced recently, newer model, wider angle. Someone cared about coverage more than appearance. I took the stairs up, stopping every 2 floors. Listening. Watching reflections in the metal handrails. The building responded the way a monitored space always does, subtle adjustments, not alarms. A door closing sooner than expected. Footsteps pausing when mine did. Someone was paying attention. On the 5th floor, I found another door that didn't belong. No apartment number. No maintenance label. Fresh paint, slightly off from the rest of the hallway. The kind of detail most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking for inconsistencies. I tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside was a small room stripped of anything personal. Folding chairs stacked against one wall. A table with scratches that hadn't been made by furniture. A portable light mounted on a stand, unplugged but positioned deliberately. This wasn't storage. It was temporary use. I didn't touch anything. I didn't need to. The absence of dust told me how often the room was accessed. The floor scuffs told me how many people stood here at once. This was a holding space, not long-term, but long enough. I stepped back into the hallway just as voices reached the stairwell. 2 men. Casual tone. Controlled pace. The sound of people who don't worry about being overheard because they believe the environment belongs to them. I moved without rushing, turning down a corridor that led to an emergency exit most residents had forgotten existed. The door opened cleanly. No alarm. No resistance. Outside, I stood in the cold air and waited. The men passed moments later, not looking around, not checking corners. They weren't searching. They were moving between points. That told me everything I needed to know. This building wasn't a destination. It was a node. Something passed through here. Briefly. Quietly. And then disappeared again, leaving behind people who convinced themselves nothing had really happened. I thought about my son, about how he'd stopped finishing sentences when certain topics came up. How he'd learned that silence reduced attention. That compliance kept routines intact. That lesson hadn't come from nowhere. It had been taught. I returned to the apartment and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the lights. My wife noticed immediately. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was trying to understand. She nodded. Then she said something that made my chest tighten. They told us it would stop if we didn't interfere. Not might stop. Would stop. That kind of promise only comes from people who plan to use the space again. I realized then why the police had left without paperwork. Why no one followed up. Why everything had been framed as temporary. Temporary keeps people patient. Temporary keeps them quiet. I looked around the apartment, our apartment, and saw it clearly for the first time since I'd come home. This wasn't just a place where something bad had happened. It was a place where people had learned to live with the idea that bad things were no longer their problem as long as they stayed invisible. That was the real danger. Not violence. Normalization. And once something like that settles into a building, it doesn't leave on its own. It waits. Which meant there were only 2 options left. Continue pretending this was still my home. Or accept that, for now, it was something else entirely. And deal with it accordingly. I waited until after midnight. My wife and son were asleep. I told myself I was stepping out for air. That wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. I didn't use force. Force leaves questions behind. Instead, I entered the building the way I would enter an unfamiliar structure overseas, carefully, assuming I was already being observed. I accessed the corridor from the basement, through a panel no one had touched in years. Someone had touched it recently. The dust was disturbed. The latch had been replaced. Whoever did it hadn't bothered to hide that fact, they hadn't needed to. Inside, the corridor smelled different. Not mold or decay, but oil and fabric. Equipment smell. Temporary, but repeated. Light fixtures had been changed to low-output bulbs. Enough visibility to move. Not enough to be noticed from outside. I moved slowly, counting intersections, memorizing exits. This place had been optimized for quiet transit, not residents, not emergencies. People. Halfway down the corridor, I found a door that didn't exist on any floor plan I remembered. It led to a storage room that had been cleared out completely. No boxes. No labels. Just clean concrete and a single camera mounted high in the corner. Active. Someone was watching this space. I didn't stay long. Surveillance works both ways, it tells you what someone thinks is important. And this room mattered. When I returned upstairs, I didn't go straight back to the apartment. I stood in the stairwell and listened to the building breathe. Pipes. Footsteps. A door closing 3 floors up. Then voices. Low. Controlled. Familiar in tone, even if I couldn't hear the words. They weren't residents. That much was clear. Back inside my apartment, I washed my hands even though they weren't dirty. Habit. Control. I checked on my son. He slept with his door open now. That hadn't been true before. Something else had changed. This wasn't just about access. It was about conditioning. Someone had taught the building how to behave. Where to look. Where not to ask questions. Which changes were for safety, and which ones weren't to be discussed at all. And the most unsettling part wasn't how thorough it was. It was how easily it had been accepted. Lying in bed, I understood the truth I'd been avoiding since I tried my key that first night. I wasn't returning to a problem. I was returning to an environment that had learned to function without me, and didn't know yet that I was no longer willing to play along. If this place was going to be treated like controlled territory, then I would treat it that way too. Even if it meant breaking into my own building again. This time, on purpose. I stopped thinking of the apartment as ours after that. Not emotionally, that part came later, but tactically. Once you name a place home, you assume rules apply. Privacy. Boundaries. Good faith. Those assumptions were liabilities now. This wasn't a residence. It was terrain. I mapped the building the way I used to map unfamiliar districts overseas, not by floor numbers, but by function. Who moved where? When? Why? Which paths were avoided? Which ones stayed active long after residents went to sleep? The elevator became irrelevant. Too visible. Too predictable. The stairs told the real story. Certain flights stayed cleaner than others. Certain railings showed where that didn't match resident traffic. Someone preferred the same routes repeatedly, trusting habit more than caution. That trust would be a weakness. I started noticing small signals left behind. Chalk marks disguised as maintenance notes. Tape residue near doorframes. Even the trash told stories, packaging that didn't belong to anyone living here, discarded at odd hours, removed quickly. Someone was careful. But not careful enough to expect resistance. At home, my family adjusted to my silence the same way they'd adjusted to everything else, by not asking. That hurt more than confrontation would have. It meant they'd learned not to expect reassurance from me anymore. That was on me. I explained what I could without naming things that would make them afraid. I told them to stay inside at night. To call me, not the building manager, if anything felt off. To treat instructions that came without explanation as suspicious. My son listened closely. Too closely. That worried me. Kids shouldn't recognize threat patterns. They shouldn't know how to behave quietly. They shouldn't understand when to disappear from a hallway without being told. Someone had already taught him that. The realization hardened something in me. I didn't confront anyone directly. Confrontation announces intent. It invites escalation. Whatever was happening here relied on not being acknowledged, on everyone pretending this was temporary, manageable, not worth drawing attention to. I wouldn't give them that comfort. Instead, I began interfering in small ways. Nothing dramatic. Just disruptions. Doors that used to open smoothly now stuck. Lights that flickered unexpectedly. Access routes that became inconvenient without being blocked. Enough to introduce friction. Enough to force adjustment. Within 2 nights, movement patterns changed. People arrived earlier. Left later. Stopped using the corridor entirely. The building reacted like a system under stress, tightening, not retreating. That told me something important. They weren't done here yet. I followed one of the men the next evening, not closely, not obviously. Just enough to see where he exited the building and how long he waited before moving on. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He thought this place was still compliant. He was wrong. Back upstairs, I sat with my son while he worked on homework. I didn't help unless he asked. I stayed visible. Present. He relaxed slowly, like someone realizing they weren't alone in a room anymore. That mattered. Because whatever was happening here wasn't just about logistics. It was about pressure. And pressure works best when people believe they're isolated. I wasn't here to escalate the situation into something violent or loud. That would put my family back into the center of it. That would undo the only advantage I still had. Instead, I planned to do something quieter. Something far more disruptive. I was going to make this building unreliable. Not dangerous. Not exposed. Just inconvenient enough that using it stopped being worth the risk. Because systems like this don't collapse when they're confronted. They collapse when they're denied efficiency. And once efficiency disappears, so does interest. This wasn't about reclaiming my home by force. It was about reminding whoever thought they owned it now that they'd misjudged the environment. And the person who had finally returned to it. I didn't sabotage anything important. That was the point. I left utilities intact. No alarms triggered. No damage that would force official attention. What I did instead was remove certainty, the quiet confidence that this place would behave the same way every time someone passed through it. Certainty is what systems depend on. The first change was timing. I started using the stairwells at irregular hours, moving through levels that were normally quiet, letting sound travel just enough to register. Not enough to provoke a response, enough to be noticed. The second change was visibility. I repositioned objects that had been placed deliberately. A chair shifted. A door left half open instead of closed. Small inconsistencies that didn't break rules but broke expectation. People notice when a space stops obeying them. Within a day, I saw hesitation. Movement slowed. Conversation stopped when footsteps approached, even when those footsteps were mine. The men who'd once moved through the building with quiet confidence now paused longer at corners, listening instead of assuming. That pause mattered. It meant the environment was no longer neutral. One night, I found a temporary camera removed. Not relocated. Removed entirely. That told me they were reducing footprint, not expanding it. Adjusting risk instead of reinforcing presence. I was close. My wife noticed the change before I mentioned it. She said the building felt different. Not safer, just unsettled. Like something was about to leave. I told her to stay inside. To keep routines normal. To let the unease exist without reacting to it. Fear invites attention. Calm makes people invisible. My son asked if it was over. I told him not yet. That answer frustrated him, but it was honest. Ending something like this isn't an event. It's a gradual withdrawal, a decision made somewhere else after the cost-benefit equation changes. I needed to make the cost higher. Late one evening, I followed the maintenance corridor again. This time, it was empty. No equipment. No fresh footprints. The camera was gone. Wires cut cleanly, not torn out. Professional exit. In the holding room on the 5th floor, the folding chairs were gone. The table remained, but it had been wiped clean, as if someone didn't want to leave even fingerprints behind. They were preparing to abandon the site. That didn't mean victory. It meant transition. I stayed alert for days afterward, watching for signs of replacement activity. There were none. No new faces. No attempts to restore access. Just silence, real silence, not the managed kind. The building began to revert. Residents relaxed without realizing why. Doors were locked again. Lights went off on schedule. Routine reclaimed the space slowly, cautiously. I didn't announce anything. I didn't report anything. Because reporting would reopen questions that no one wanted asked, and attention cuts both ways. Sometimes the safest outcome is one that leaves no record. One evening, as I stood in the stairwell where it had all begun, I realized something unexpected. This wasn't about stopping a crime. It was about reclaiming normalcy before abnormal became permanent. My family didn't need justice. They needed their home back. And quietly, without confrontation or recognition, that's what had happened. The men who thought they controlled this building had left nothing behind. No evidence. No explanation. Just absence. Which was exactly what they'd relied on in the first place. Only now, the absence belonged to us. The change didn't announce itself. It never does when something leaves quietly. One day the stairwell smelled like concrete again instead of oil. The light stopped flickering at odd hours. Doors that had always felt slightly ajar settled back into their frames like they belonged there. The building exhaled. Residents didn't talk about it. That was another sign things were returning to normal. People only discuss danger while it's present. Once it fades, silence becomes a kind of agreement, an unspoken decision to move on. I watched that happen from a distance. I stopped patrolling. Stopped listening for footsteps that weren't supposed to be there. I let routines return without interfering. Normality needs space to rebuild itself. Pushing too hard risks drawing attention back to something that's finally loosening its grip. At home, the shift was slower. My son slept with his door closed again. He stopped checking the hallway when voices echoed through the building. His shoulders loosened in ways I hadn't realized were tense until they weren't anymore. One night, he asked me a question he hadn't asked since I came back. Is it really over? I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was complicated. It's not here anymore, I said finally. That was enough. The building manager sent out a notice about routine maintenance changes and security updates. The wording was vague, carefully neutral. No mention of why. No acknowledgement that anything unusual had ever taken place. That kind of language isn't meant to inform. It's meant to close a chapter. I understood the impulse. So did everyone else. Nobody wanted to reopen a period of uncertainty that had taught them how fragile safety could be. Forgetting, in this case, was a form of healing. I let it happen. A week passed. Then another. No unfamiliar faces. No late-night movement. No sense of being observed. The environment returned to what it had been before, not perfectly, but convincingly enough. I walked the building one last time, not as reconnaissance, but as confirmation. I moved the way a resident moves, distracted, unguarded, thinking about things unrelated to threat. That felt good. Back in the apartment, my wife noticed the difference before I said anything. She asked if I was done. Yes, I said. She didn't ask what that meant. We didn't need to name it. The building hadn't been saved by force or exposure. It had been reclaimed by making itself inconvenient to misuse. By refusing to cooperate quietly. By letting whoever had been using it realize the advantage was gone. That kind of resolution doesn't leave trophies. It leaves routines. Later that night, I stood at the window and looked out at the street I'd recognized the day I came home. Cars passed. People moved with no awareness of what had almost become permanent here. That was the point. I realized then that what unsettled me most wasn't what had happened while I was gone. It was how close it had come to becoming normal. Absence creates space. And space, left unattended, invites things that don't belong. I closed the window and turned off the light, finally able to treat the apartment like a home again instead of a position. The building had learned a new lesson. So had I. Danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits patiently, hoping no one will notice. This time, someone had. And next time, wherever it tried to settle, I knew exactly what it would fear most. Not confrontation. Attention. Life didn't snap back into place. It eased. That distinction mattered. Sudden normality would have felt suspicious. Instead, the building returned to itself in increments, a hallway conversation that lasted a little longer than before, a door held open without hesitation, a laugh that didn't cut off when footsteps approached. Safety doesn't arrive with certainty. It arrives with permission to relax. I watched my family relearn that permission carefully. My wife stopped checking the locks twice before bed. My son stopped memorizing exit routes without realizing he'd been doing it at all. The habits faded quietly, like scars you forget are there until you look closely. I didn't interfere. Intervention ends threats. Patience repairs people. At work, I kept my distance from anything that would pull me away again too quickly. Not because I was afraid of leaving, but because I understood what leaving meant now. Absence creates gaps, and gaps don't stay empty. They get filled. One afternoon, I noticed something that hadn't changed. The residents still didn't talk about what had happened. They greeted each other. Complained about the elevators. Argued about parking. But no one referenced the months when things had felt wrong. The silence remained, not enforced, just chosen. I understood that too. Naming something gives it shape. And shape gives it weight. For some people, it's easier to let unease dissolve into routine than to carry it openly. I respected that. Late one evening, I found my son sitting on the stairs, scrolling through his phone without really looking at it. I sat beside him without asking why. After a while, he spoke. "They're not coming back, right?" "No," I said. "Not here." He nodded and leaned back against the wall. "That's good," he said. I didn't like how quiet everyone was before. Neither did I. Quiet like that isn't peace. It's compliance. That night, I walked through the building again, not checking for threats, but checking for life. Open doors. Music playing. Someone cooking late enough to burn something. All the small signs of people existing without calculating risk. That's when I felt the last tension leave. Whatever had been using this place had moved on. And whatever damage it had done was being absorbed back into ordinary days, where it belonged. Before bed, I looked at the door. The new lock stayed. Not because we needed it anymore. But because it reminded me of something important. Safety isn't permanent. It's maintained. The house I hadn't recognized when I came home was familiar again. Not because it had never changed, but because change had finally stopped being imposed from the outside. I turned off the lights and lay down without listening for footsteps. That was the real victory. Not removing the threat. But removing its influence. And understanding that home isn't just a place you return to. It's a place you actively protect, even when no one else sees the work being done. Weeks passed without incident. That alone felt unnatural at first. After living inside quiet tension for so long, peace didn't register as relief, it registered as uncertainty. I kept waiting for something to surface, for a correction, for proof that the absence was temporary. It wasn't. The building settled into itself the way places do when nothing is pressing on them anymore. Maintenance returned to routine schedules. Notices on the board became boring again. People stopped glancing down hallways before speaking. Normal is louder than you remember. I noticed something else too. No one asked what had happened. Not neighbors. Not the building manager. Not even extended family who knew something had been wrong. The lack of curiosity wasn't ignorance, it was agreement. Everyone had decided, individually, that understanding would cost more than forgetting. That's how most things survive. They don't require belief. Just silence. At work, I was offered another assignment. This one domestic. Short term. Close enough to be home most nights. The kind of compromise that didn't exist before I learned how to ask for it. I accepted. The job didn't feel smaller. It felt more deliberate. At home, routines formed without effort. Dinner times. Arguments about trivial things. Doors left open again. My son grew impatient with my questions, which I took as a good sign. It meant vigilance had loosened its grip. One evening, he brought up the incident on his own. Not details. Just a comment. I thought you wouldn't believe me if I told you back then. That stayed with me. Not because he was wrong, but because he was probably right. Before I left, I trusted systems more than instinct. Authority more than observation. I might have dismissed what he'd seen as exaggeration. Absence had taught him something I hadn't known how to explain. That adults don't always arrive in time. I told him I was sorry. Not for being gone, that conversation was bigger than one evening, but for not being reachable. For letting silence decide things for us. He didn't respond immediately. Then he said, "You're here now." That was enough. I thought about the people who had used this building as if it were a tool. How they depended on routine, on indifference, on the assumption that no one would interfere quietly enough to matter. They'd been wrong. Not because someone fought them. But because someone paid attention. That's what made the difference. I never learned where they went after leaving. I didn't try to find out. Knowing would only reattach meaning to something that no longer deserved space in our lives. The building didn't need answers. It needed distance. One night, standing by the window, I realized the street looked exactly the same as it had the day I came home. But this time, when I turned the key in the door, it opened without resistance. And for the first time since my return, that simple motion felt like proof. Not that nothing bad had happened. But that it was over. And that silence, finally, belonged to us again. I didn't expect closure to feel this quiet. No apologies arrived. No explanations surfaced. Nothing official ever acknowledged what the building had been used for or why it stopped being useful. Life simply continued, folding over the gap the way it always does when no one insists on reopening it. That was fine with me. Because closure, I learned, isn't something you're given. It's something you recognize when the weight finally lifts enough to breathe normally again. Months later, I realized I'd stopped scanning rooms when I entered them. Stopped listening for footsteps that didn't match the time of day. Stopped measuring exits in my head before sitting down. Those habits don't disappear overnight. They loosen. And one day, you notice they're gone. My son started bringing friends over again. Loud ones. Careless ones. The kind who leave doors open and forget where they put their shoes. The building absorbed that noise without reacting, without tightening around it. That was the clearest sign. The place no longer needed to manage itself. One evening, as I watched them leave, my wife asked a question she hadn't asked since I came home. "Do you think they ever knew who you were?" I thought about it carefully. "No," I said. "And that's why it worked." She nodded. Some actions only succeed because they aren't recognized as actions at all. They don't challenge authority or announce resistance. They just refuse to cooperate quietly. That refusal had been enough. I kept the new lock. Not out of fear, but as a reminder. Not every change is a threat. Some are a response to something you didn't see coming. And some reminders are worth keeping, even after the danger is gone. On the anniversary of my return, I stood in the hallway outside our apartment and listened. Nothing unusual. Just life moving around us, uncalculated and unafraid. I thought back to the moment my key hadn't worked, the instant when I realized home had shifted without asking permission. I'd felt displaced then, like I was arriving late to something already decided. In a way, I had. But I also understood now that coming home isn't a single moment. It's a process. One that continues long after you unlock the door. The house I didn't recognize had taught me something I hadn't learned anywhere else. Danger doesn't always force its way in. Sometimes it waits to be invited by absence. And safety doesn't return with authority or explanation. It returns when someone is present enough to notice what doesn't belong. I turned the key and stepped inside, no longer wondering who else might have been there before me. The apartment was ours again. Not because nothing had happened. But because whatever had happened no longer had a place to stay. That's the part no one writes down. The part where nothing explodes. No one confesses. No truth is formally acknowledged. Just a quiet understanding that something ended because someone came back, and stayed. This was the hidden chapter. The one where the house didn't need saving. It needed someone to recognize it again. And this time, I did. More hidden chapters are coming. Like the video and subscribe if you want to hear them. One last thought: would silence be enough? Leave your comment below the video.